Now, speaking on behalf of industry, I think industry absolutely gets that we need to create things of value. That's the only way this system is going to work. That's the only way we can be sustainable as an industry and meaningful stakeholders in this overall equation. The greatest threat to industry, I'm going to argue, and to our overall healthcare ecosystem, which is enabling innovation, is uncertainty. And we live in a world that has a fair amount of uncertainty today with the regulatory review. It's, I would say, perhaps at one level gotten better, but it remains fairly inconsistent depending on the quality of your individual reviewer, all the way up to some fairly major differences between major regulatory agencies around the world in terms of what they expect. What's at stake is the cost of developing drugs. These are numbers we, and I'm sure you know well, $1 billion to develop a drug, $1 billion or more. The time, 10 to 15 years. The number that make it through, between 1 in 10, 1 in 5, or 1 in 100, depending on when in the process you begin to take count. So thinking about how we bring greater certainty to this equation is going to be key. And so just a few brief marks to complete here. My background, which frames my perspective on this, I spent a lot of time in the intensive care unit using highly expensive technologies and having many end-of-life conversations, and certainly as we think about the challenges to our healthcare system, that's one place to start. I entered industry working on the research side and developed a tremendous appreciation for the resources that could be brought to bear on a problem and the role that industry can play as a convener, and I'm now in the role overseeing the complex integrated aspect of how do you create and lead a healthcare company, recognizing that we are in the business of taking care of people. So assessing value, what's at stake? I think there's two major buckets here. One is patient outcomes, and the second is the strength of this healthcare ecosystem. We have to think about them both. I think, as Carol highlighted, the patient at the end of the day is what this system is designed to do, is to take care of the individual. And recognizing and thinking about patient outcomes, we should recognize healthcare is incredibly personal. As patients, and one thing, we don't have to look across the aisle and say, you know, do I know any patients? You can just look in the mirror, and we've all had that experience, I suspect. We recognize the vulnerability of being a patient, the need to trust, and you have to trust the science, the review, the risk-benefit assessment that's made, who's judging what risks you as an individual are willing to take, vis-a-vis the benefit that might be afforded by an intervention. And then, of course, society overlays all this as we think about what's affordable. So what's at stake? Why should we care about the health of our healthcare ecosystem? And I have to say I'm struck by the fact that we have a reasonable chance of dying of a bacterial pneumonia in 2013. Resistance, antibiotic resistance is a big issue. The example of drug-resistant tuberculosis, you get on an airplane, you don't know who's sitting next to you. Major public health issues like malaria remain, and then of course chronic diseases, self-inflicted perhaps, but major drain on the overall healthcare system. And we need solutions to these, and these solutions are going to come out of this healthcare ecosystem, so we need to nurture it. That healthcare ecosystem, this is a perhaps fairly simplistic schematic of it, but how do ideas occur, where do they come from, how do they get developed and ultimately yield a therapy? It starts in the right-hand side, academia, public funding. Industry by itself has no better chance of developing a new therapy than anybody else, arguably. You can't give somebody $5 billion and reliably get a drug. So there's a certain mathematical equation here which says you need to be able to access the entire academic network. You never know where that next idea is going to pop. And what industry brings then is the ability, once the idea pops, is to now bring resources to bear to begin to answer the developmental questions and the large amount of resources that are required to ultimately determine that something is safe and effective. The venture capital piece in there is this system does not work without other sources of funding. We are overly dependent as a globe on the United States National Institute Health funding of academia, and I can tell you it's paltry. It is small. And so thinking about how we do a better job there and recognizing that the venture capitalists need to have certainty before they put their dollars at risk. Industry, as I said, and we've talked about the regulator, provider all the way up to the payer. And now, the sustainability of the healthcare system is a key component of this whole ecosystem. And again, determining what is affordable and how do we think about affordability is key. So assessing value, I think, is quite simple at one level, and people have talked about it. It's quite easy to describe the safety and efficacy. It's much more subjective to think about risk-benefit, and then underlying all of that, you've got cost. But it's the variables that I think we need to be particularly attentive to, and we work at one end of the spectrum with rare diseases. Rare diseases are handicapped by having small data sets. Data is incomplete. There would be many questions it'd be great to know the answers to. You can't. How do you deal with the fact that you've got incomplete data for good or bad reasons? Do you throw out 10 years of work simply because somebody forgot to dot an I? Personal and societal differences in what we value, we've heard those discussed. The subjective nature of much of what we do. Comparators, there is no consensus as to what is the comparator. And again, you don't go back and rerun your phase 3 programs because somebody said, gee, it would have been great if you'd compared it to this. And one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is that whoever's sitting in judgment brings a narrow lens to this problem, and if it's all about cost, I think the healthcare ecosystem loses, and when the healthcare ecosystem loses, the patient will lose. So we need to be thoughtful. Thank you.